Have you ever noticed that everything suddenly gets better exactly when you stop worrying? It sounds like a paradox. The truth is that we have been told all our lives, set goals, fight, achieve. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if it is our attachments to people that lead to expectations that become the very anchor that pulls us to the bottom? In relationships, work, and even in search of inner peace, Carl Jung, a genius of psychology, discovered an unpleasant truth for many. The more desperately you cling to control, the faster life slips out of your hands. And today we will figure out why the ability to let go is perhaps the only path to true freedom. Stay until the end. This simple shift in perception can turn everything upside down. And if you want to learn more about your own psychology, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We hold tightly to our ideas about how it should be, and at this very moment, life seems to mock you, everything goes awry. Attachment, which in theory should provide a sense of stability, in fact often turns into a source of constant anxiety. The trick is that you only have to unclench your fists, and the world seems to sigh with relief. Jung talked about this. Straight up, why are you chasing? Running away. What are you accepting? It transforms. We live in a society where an eternal race is cultivated, where the world is always somewhere out there, beyond the next line. But it is precisely this neurotic need to control everything that prevents real change. It is not about folding your arms and going with the flow, but about a much more subtle transition from a state of constant tension to a state of conscious observation. Studying the secrets of the human psyche, we have discovered an important law. While we are obsessed with our fantasies, ideal images of partners, a brilliant career, a happy future, we do not see what is actually happening inside us. Real change happens not when we beat our last strength against a wall, but when we finally stop resisting the natural course of things. Not out of weakness, but out of awareness. Letting go is not giving up, it is allowing something new to happen that does not depend solely on our will. It is an act of trust in the invisible wisdom that directs the course of our lives. And when this does happen, chaos suddenly makes sense, opportunities present themselves without an exhausting chase. And the perpetual anxiety is replaced by a strange feeling of finally being present in your own life. Letting go is not giving up a dream, but giving up the obsession that everything should be exactly as you planned. It is an exit from the prison of one's own "I should" and an entrance into the spacious space of awareness. But what if it is not the person we are attached to, but what we have invested in them? Jung was categorical. We almost never cling to another person. We cling to our projections in the hope that they will give us the confirmation, the love, the salvation that we so lack. We assign people to roles that they did not even agree to play, that we do not want to see in ourselves. We are amazingly persistent in searching for in others, sometimes idealizing, sometimes demonizing them. It is in this distorted mirror that very painful attachment is born. Our ego tries to turn the external world into its extension, to appropriate it. Like a child appropriates toys, the fear of being unnecessary disguises itself as a manic desire for success. The thirst for painful dependence on relationships, what we take for high aspirations, often turns out to be just an attempt to plug some inner hole, but no one can live up to the role they've been forced on them forever. When illusions are shattered, all that's left is bitter disappointment. Jung saw this as a defense mechanism of the psyche. It's much easier to blame others than to come face to face with the parts of ourselves we try so hard to hide. But when we finally become aware of our projections, a miracle happens. Reality begins to change. The other person ceases to be a screen for our fantasies and becomes simply a person with their own strengths and weaknesses. The process of losing illusions is painful, but it gives incredible relief. It is the beginning of an honest relationship, first of all, with yourself. When you stop running after what you think will make you whole, a paradox happens. You suddenly find yourself closer to yourself than ever before, and then, without any additional effort, almost magically, everything really starts to fall into place. When we stop trying to dominate everything, space opens up in us for more. To desperately cling to something that, by its nature, cannot be controlled, here lies a subtle but crucial distinction between having an inner sense of direction and the obsessive need to control every step. The former is born from harmony with oneself, the latter, from fear, cleverly disguised as competence. We make plans, try to foresee every possible scenario, as if this could guarantee us safety. But in reality, such hypercontrol is merely the ego's attempt to avoid the inevitable, the unpredictability of life. Jung said that neurosis always becomes a substitute for genuine experience. In this sense, control works like an anesthetic. Instead of feeling, we overload our minds with strategies. Instead of meeting our vulnerability, we hide behind routine, goals, and promises, as if total supervision over every aspect of life could protect us from the pain of simply being human. But to control does not mean to live. It means to exist inside an artificial capsule, where we voluntarily sacrifice spontaneity for the illusion of stability. Yet it is spontaneity that gives life its color, freshness, and authenticity. Without it, relationships turn into mechanical rituals, work becomes a burdensome duty, and even the most eventful day loses its fullness. The inflated ego firmly believes it must and can handle everything. It insists there is only one right way to live, an ideal model of being. Any deviation from that template triggers guilt, anxiety, and self-criticism. The mind enters a state of hyperactivity, like an overloaded operating system running 10 programs at once. In this context, psychological and emotional exhaustion is not weakness, it's the natural consequence of such a way of existing. Deep down, the controller is a defense against surrender, against letting go. But surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means recognizing that there are forces both within us and in life itself that do not submit to our will. Jung saw the unconscious as a living, autonomous system that actively participates in shaping our reality. When we ignore this layer, we get stuck in a rational trap, as if every problem could be solved purely with logic. Letting go of control is an act of trust, acknowledging that even chaos holds its own wisdom, and that there is a path within the unexpected. This doesn't mean living without direction, but rather being open to life surprising us. But how can this be possible in a world where we try to plan even our moments of silence? The more we strive to make everything go according to plan, the further we move from ourselves. And on the contrary, when we allow ourselves to simply observe, listen, and feel without immediately intervening, we begin to notice that life has its own rhythm. And it knows perfectly well where it is leading us. What if true freedom isn't in control, but in the ego's ability to adapt? That moment when the ego, exhausted from trying to hold everything together, finally loosens its grip and turns to something deeper, the self. The self is the center of our psyche, the wholeness of being, not the social mask or role we play, but who we are when we stop pretending. As long as the ego is in charge, our lives are organized around external expectations, how we should behave, look, what others expect from us. Letting go of these imposed ideas is not a return to the past, but a movement toward the core. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who we truly are through the integration of the conscious and unconscious. This journey begins with small breakthroughs, when you stop reacting according to old patterns, when you realize you no longer have to maintain a certain role, when after a breakup, instead of rushing to fill the void, you sit with it, alone. These moments of letting go become portals. They don't promise instant comfort, but they open space for authenticity. True surrender begins when the ego recognizes its limits, when it realizes it doesn't have to control everything or know all the answers. That's when something quiet awakens inside us, the self. It doesn't impose or shout, it guides with clear simplicity. Its messages come not from logic, but from inner resonance, from what feels meaningful, even if we can't immediately explain it. Such letting go is far from passivity. It's a more refined form of presence, to act without obsession with the outcome, to love without demanding reciprocity, to create without needing to prove anything. In this state, the driving force becomes not the thirst for recognition, but inner wholeness, which doesn't need applause to simply be. In the process of individuation, the ego doesn't disappear, it changes its position. Instead of claiming absolute truth, it begins to serve the self. This inner transformation changes everything. Relationships become more sincere, decisions more meaningful, and life, once something to conquer, now unfolds as an experience to be lived. Letting go in this context is not loss, it is integration. It is allowing what needs to leave, and what is ready to emerge to come forth. In this gesture, we stop existing as a collection of roles and begin to live as whole beings. But for the self to manifest, we must first confront another defense, the persona. Persona, one of Jung's key concepts, is the social mask we wear to be accepted. It's necessary, we live in society. The problem begins when we identify with it too much and start living for the image. The need to appear strong, spiritual, successful, perfect. All these labels may sound noble but come at a high cost. Constant vigilance, exhaustion from playing the part, and worst of all, disconnection from the self. It is impossible to be whole when most of our energy goes into maintaining a role. Jung saw the persona as a necessary but limited tool, a bridge between our inner and outer worlds. The problem arises when we forget that there's more behind it. When our attachment to the image becomes so strong that any threat to it triggers fear, anger, or a defensive reaction, that's the moment we stop living and start managing impressions. Freedom begins when we realize we don't need to maintain a fixed story about ourselves. We can be wrong, change our minds, contradict ourselves. We don't have to be consistent with who we were yesterday, only honest about who we are now. That's where authenticity is born, even if not everyone will like it. Letting go of the persona is a radical step. It requires courage to show up without armor, to allow ourselves to be ourselves, even if it destroys the image we spent years building. But it's this very act that liberates us. It's like stepping off a poorly acted stage and finally breathing fully, becoming the author of our own lines. Jung put it perfectly, he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens. Attachment to the image is a kind of waking dream, the belief that we are only what we show. Awakening begins when we acknowledge the complexity our mask cannot contain. And in that recognition, true life begins. Behind the mask lies what we fear to see, the shadow. Freedom is frightening, though many claim to want it. Few are willing to look at it honestly. Because being free means having no refuge, not in people, not in roles, not in promises. It means taking responsibility, even for the parts of ourselves we don't want to see. And that's where the shadow lives. According to Jung, the shadow is the repressed part of the psyche, everything we reject or ignore. It's not necessarily evil, more often it's something that didn't fit into our ideal image. The more we deny this part, the more power it gains. A person who says they want freedom is often afraid of what might come with it: emptiness, silence, lack of support. So they cling to another person, to work, or to an idealized future, not out of love, but from fear of what happens when the foundation vanishes. Letting go doesn't only mean releasing the external, it also means looking inward. What remains when the desire is unmet? What happens when a relationship ends or a plan fails? In that empty space, the shadow appears, and it doesn't arrive gently. Sometimes it shows up as anger, jealousy, deep sadness, emotions we don't want to admit. But it takes courage to go through this experience without sugarcoating it. Jung said there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Transformation happens when we stop fearing the shadow, and it stops controlling us. We begin to embrace those forgotten parts of ourselves. The need, fear, and vulnerability as true aspects of the self. Not to surrender to them, but to learn to control them. Letting go ceases to be merely a gesture of freeing another person, and becomes a meeting with what we were taught to reject. The shadow is not what prevents us from living, it is what we must accept in order to live fully. Only the one who passes through this inner space can experience a freedom not dependent on anything but oneself. The shadow appears where we least expect it, often in the relationships we call love. We frequently confuse love with need. The boundary between wanting to be with someone and fearing to be without them can be subtle, but it matters. Jung said, real love begins where projection ends. As long as we are attached to what the other person represents, we cannot see them as they are, and often, we also don't see ourselves. At the beginning of a relationship, it's natural to idealize a partner, projecting our expectations as if they were feelings. We assign the other person the role of emotional support and safety, and unintentionally create dependence. They stop being a person and become a role. At this moment, we may not see them as a source of affection or intimacy, but as fear disguised as love, fear of loss, fear of insufficiency. The other must be near so that I can feel okay. And if they leave, I fall apart. But love that binds like this isn't love, it's need. When we release those bonds, what remains is the truth. Yes, we do love this person, but we also use them as a shield against parts of ourselves we haven't accepted yet. Letting go doesn't mean love ends. It is the beginning of love in its purest form. Allowing the other to exist without having to permanently occupy space in our life. Loving without possessing. Relating to the real person, not to the projection we imposed. This requires maturity. An acceptance that the other is free, can change, can leave, and still deserves our respect. It also requires inner reorganization. Instead of seeking wholeness in another, we find within ourselves a base from which we can love without losing ourselves. Love that does not demand possession is not cold or distant. On the contrary, it is more present because it is not fed by fear. It is when we do not erase ourselves. It is coexistence without dissolution. A sharing of wholeness that begins where projection ends. That's when real connection begins. A meeting of two consciousnesses that don't cancel each other or merge, but recognize each other. And yet, keeping up this mask and dependency requires a lot of energy. Eventually, the effort to hold on simply fails. The image created to match expectations begins to fall apart. What once felt like control becomes a burden. And fatigue, once thought to be physical, reveals the ego is exhausted. This exhaustion is not laziness or weakness. It is the quiet cry of the subconscious. A pause as if something inside says, I can't pretend anymore. And that is when the true self begins to emerge. Not with excitement, but with a certain calm that comes when something ends. Jung saw such crises as calls to truth. When the inner world disorganizes, it's a sign that a new structure is forming on a different level. Burnout, so common today, is not only due to overstimulation, but also to an overload of roles, too many expectations, and too little alignment with what we truly feel. A life built on maintaining an image requires constant energy, weighing words, emotions, reactions, always staying in control. But when the body fails, the mind blocks and the will vanishes. Something demands attention. Who are you without all this? At this moment, letting go becomes a real alternative. Not as an escape, but as liberation. You understand. You no longer need to force anything. You don't need to prove your worth. You can pause and not disappear. On the contrary, you begin to show up more authentically. The ego resists. It fears that without effort, everything will collapse. But surrender is not giving up. It is a form of psychological wisdom. An acknowledgement that there is a limit. And crossing that limit by force leads only to emptiness. Jung knew the ignored psyche produces symptoms, but when heard, it opens the way. Fatigue from the mask is an invitation to pause, to ask what really matters, to admit that sometimes we just need to rest, to let go of the role, and let something real emerge in the silence. When the mask falls, what remains is pain, rarely talked about. The grief of losing someone we never truly were. Letting go is often portrayed as freedom, but rarely as the pain it brings. Letting go is also a kind of death. Not physical but symbolic, and sometimes just as intense. Letting go of ideas, of relationships, of future projections, is grieving what never happened. And this grief is truth. Jung saw suffering not as a mistake to eliminate, but as a necessary process of transformation. Without death, there is no rebirth. This applies to both outer and inner cycles. When something must go, a failed plan, a broken love, a lost identity, even necessary endings cause pain. Letting go is not a cold, rational decision, but a deep emotional process. That leads us to silence, doubt, and vulnerability. Emptiness appears when what we relied on ceases to exist. And though it frightens us, this emptiness can also be fertile. It brings contradictory feelings. Relief and sadness, freedom and loneliness, courage and fear. This is psychological grief, not only for the loss, but for the image we upheld, for the scenario that now won't play out. The ego suffers. It seeks answers, reasons why it didn't work. But the true self follows a different logic. Sometimes what fails is exactly what sends us inward, toward reevaluation, restoration, and finally, release. Respecting this grief is as important as letting go, because only by feeling it, not denying it, can we transform. We should not cling to suffering, but we also shouldn't ignore it. Conscious suffering has its own time, and in that time something ripens. Letting go also teaches us to face invisible losses, the kind that leave no visible trace, but wound the soul deeply. Yet in that unseen wound, a new life quietly awakens, not as a promise, but as a possibility. When what once held us dissolves, something interesting happens. The world does not end. On the contrary, it begins to rebuild. The silence that once scared us becomes nourishing. The emptiness once feared becomes a space. It is in that space that new things grow. Things that couldn't be born while everything was filled with control, expectations, and noise. It's like opening a window after years of it being shut. Dust dances in the light. The air shifts. At first it feels strange, but then comes breath and with it presence. The mind stops racing and starts listening. To the body, to time, to subtle feelings. Imagine someone who spent years in a relationship with no real exchange, who stayed from fear, attachment, or habit, and finally they let go. Not only of the other person, but of the illusion that it must go on. Silence arrives. Emptiness. But soon space. And in that space, the person returns to creativity. Not as a task, but as self-expression. Writing, cooking, walking, listening to music in the dark. Jung spoke of psychic energy that returns when we stop feeding the ego. Everything we once used to maintain the mask, to control the future, to resist the present, becomes available again. And it flows into creativity, not just artistic, but existential. Creativity is not only about painting or writing poems. It is about reorganizing your life, transforming suffering into practical wisdom. Creativity begins where you stop reacting and start choosing consciously. Only when space appears can intuition begin to speak louder. Once suppressed by fear, now it's clearer. You begin to see connections where there used to be problems. Ideas come spontaneously. Answers appear without forcing. Time also changes. The day no longer feels like a battlefield. You slow down not from laziness, but from inner alignment. Decisions become easier, because you are no longer trying to prove anything. And what's interesting, things that once seemed unreachable begin to come to you. Not through magic, but because you stopped standing in their way. Imagine an artist blocked by the demand for genius. Exhausted, they let go of the project. They rest, walk, and suddenly, in the space of nothing, a new idea comes, alive and spontaneous. That is the power of letting go. When you release what is true, you create space for it to be born. This free state of creativity and connection to the self is the opposite of ego logic. The ego seeks control and results. The self seeks truth and harmony. When the ego steps aside, the self gently leads. It doesn't force, it guides. It manifests through what brings you joy, even if no one sees it or it brings no results. Here, letting go shows its most beautiful face. It is not just loss, but a transition, a bridge between what was and what can be. Letting go brings you back to yourself, without the excess, without the noise, without the weights that are no longer yours. The space that opens after letting go is not a void to fear, but a fertile soil awaiting your true presence. Life doesn't shout, it whispers. And when you become more attentive and internally cleansed, you begin to listen. In the end, it all comes down to one quiet gesture, an open hand, letting go of identities, fears, and repeated stories. Not out of exhaustion, though often that is the beginning, but out of clarity. There comes a moment when holding on costs more than losing. Attachment may feel familiar, but it's not love. It is born of fear and the attempt to keep something alive that has already served its purpose. To love means to allow the other to exist. To allow life to flow, even if it doesn't match our expectations. Control is not a sign of strength. It is a subtle form of resistance. The ego tries to force reality to conform to its desires. But a life built on that logic is a life in constant tension. And no soul can endure that for long. Jung knew, healing doesn't happen when we force change. It happens when we accept what is. When we stop fighting life and begin to listen to it. When we release the chase for what should be and look courageously at what is. Acceptance is not surrender. It is the open door through which real transformation enters. So now the most important question. What are you still holding on to? What image, identity, or expectation still occupies space within you, blocking the arrival of the new? What will happen if you let it go? Letting go is a risk, but holding on is too. Often staying imprisoned is more dangerous than fearing change, because we are not here to play a role. We are here to live, and a truly lived life requires courage. The courage to shed layers that no longer fit. The courage to move closer to what truly matters. The courage to simply be. Life begins where the illusion of control ends, and in that quiet, intimate moment, you return to yourself, not as an ideal but as presence, and from there, everything that really matters finds its way. If this message resonates with you, turn on notifications so you don't miss future reflections on letting go, self-awareness, and Jungian depth psychology applied to daily life. If you've made it to the end, leave a comment. I release what no longer belongs to me. So I'll know you've walked this path with me, and that this message reached your soul. See you in the next video.